The Greenbrier Ghost, a tale of love, loss, and the unseen. The winter winds of 1897 swept through the hills of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, carrying with them an air of quiet foreboding. The land, blanketed in frost and silence, seemed untouched by the chaos of the world beyond its borders. Here, life moved at a pace dictated by the seasons, by the rhythm of the sun and the toil of those who called the Appalachian Mountains their home. In a small cabin on the outskirts of the county, Zona Shue hummed softly to herself as she stirred a pot of stew over the fire. The warm glow of the hearth illuminated her delicate features, her auburn hair catching the light like strands of copper. She was a striking woman, full of life and vitality, her laughter a melody that had once filled the woods around her home. But in recent months, that laughter had become rare, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken secret. Her husband, Erasmus Edward Shue, sat in a wooden chair near the window, sharpening a blade with methodical precision. His dark eyes flicked up occasionally to watch Zona as she worked, but his expression remained unreadable. There was a hardness to Edward, a coldness that had only grown more pronounced since their wedding day less than a year ago. Zona had been swept off her feet by Edward's charm, his rugged good looks, and his promises of a better life. But beneath his handsome exterior lay a temper that flared like a storm, unpredictable and dangerous. She had learned to tread carefully around him, her once fiery spirit dimmed by the weight of his presence. As the stew simmered, Zona glanced out the window, her gaze drifting to the snow-covered hills beyond. A sense of unease gnawed at her, though she couldn't quite place its source. Perhaps it was the isolation of their cabin, far from the nearest neighbor. Or perhaps it was the way Edward's moods shifted like the wind, leaving her constantly on edge. "Dinner's ready," she said softly, setting two bowls on the rough-hewn table. Edward stood, his movements deliberate, and took his place at the table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the clink of spoons against ceramic. Zona's mind wandered as she ate, her thoughts straying to her mother, Mary Jane Hester, who lived just a few miles away. She hadn't seen her in weeks, and the ache of homesickness was a constant companion. "I'm going to visit Ma tomorrow," Zona said, breaking the silence. Edward's spoon paused midair, and he looked at her with a frown. "You don't need to be running off every time you feel like it," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've got responsibilities here." Zona's heart sank, but she kept her tone steady. "It's been weeks, Edward. She'll be worried about me." He set his spoon down with a thud, his gaze hardening. "I said no. That should be the end of it." Zona nodded, swallowing her frustration along with the lump in her throat. She knew better than to push him when he was in this mood. The rest of the meal passed in strained silence, and when they finally retired for the night, Zona lay awake long after Edward's snores filled the room. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and longing. She missed her mother's comforting presence, missed the days when her laughter had come easily. But most of all, she missed the sense of freedom she had once taken for granted. As sleep finally claimed her, Zona dreamed of a time before Edward, before the weight of his anger had settled over her like a shroud. In her dreams, she was running through the woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees and the sound of her mother's voice calling her home. The days passed in a blur of routine and tension. Zona busied herself with chores, finding solace in the rhythm of her work. But the unease that had taken root in her heart only grew, a shadow that refused to be ignored. One crisp January morning, Edward left early, claiming he had business to attend to in town. Zona watched him ride off, her breath clouding in the cold air. The moment he was out of sight, she felt a weight lift from her chest, replaced by a sense of urgency. She gathered her shawl and stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The path to her mother's house was familiar, the trees standing like silent sentinels as she made her way through the woods. With each step, her resolve grew stronger. She needed to see her mother, needed to feel the warmth of her embrace and hear her reassuring words. When she arrived at the Hester home, Mary Jane greeted her with open arms, her face lighting up at the sight of her daughter. "Zona, my girl, I was beginning to worry about you," she said, pulling her into a tight hug. Zona smiled, but the worry in her mother's eyes didn't escape her notice. "I'm fine, Ma. I just needed to see you." Mary Jane led her inside, the warmth of the fire and the smell of freshly baked bread enveloping Zona like a comforting blanket. They spent the day talking, laughing, and catching up, but Zona couldn't bring herself to share the full extent of her troubles. She didn't want to burden her mother or risk causing a rift between Mary Jane and Edward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Zona reluctantly prepared to leave. Mary Jane walked her to the door, her hand lingering on Zona's arm. "If you ever need anything, you come straight to me," she said, her voice firm. Zona nodded, her heart aching with gratitude. "I will, Ma. I promise." The journey back to the cabin was uneventful, but the sense of unease returned the moment Zona stepped through the door. Edward was sitting by the fire, his expression unreadable as he watched her enter. "Where've you been?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with an edge. "I went to see Ma," Zona replied, keeping her voice steady. Edward's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought he might explode. But instead, he merely nodded and turned back to the fire. Zona released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knew she had taken a risk by defying him, but the visit to her mother had been worth it. It had reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone, that there was still a spark of hope to hold onto. But that spark would soon be extinguished. The Greenbrier Ghost, A Tale of Love, Loss, and the Unseen, Part 2. The days that followed Zona's visit to her mother were marked by an uneasy calm. Edward's mood had been surprisingly subdued, though it was hard to tell whether this was genuine or the quiet before another storm. Zona carried on with her daily routines, finding small moments of solace in the beauty of the surrounding landscape. The snow-covered hills shimmered in the sunlight, and the forest seemed alive with whispers of life beneath the frozen surface. But beneath this peaceful veneer, Zona's unease continued to grow. It was as if the woods themselves were trying to warn her, the rustling branches and the distant calls of crows filling her with an inexplicable dread. She often found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. One evening, as she sat by the fire mending a tear in her dress, Edward returned home earlier than usual. His boots thudded heavily against the wooden floor as he entered, and Zona immediately sensed that something was different. "You've been quiet lately," Edward said, his tone neutral but his gaze sharp. Zona looked up, startled by the suddenness of his comment. "Just tired, that's all," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Edward didn't respond immediately. He walked to the fire and stared into the flames, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "You're not hiding anything from me, are you?" The question hung in the air like a blade, sharp and dangerous. Zona's hands stilled, the needle trembling between her fingers. "Of course not," she said, forcing a smile. Edward turned to face her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read her thoughts. For a moment, the room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. But then he shrugged and sat down in his chair, as if satisfied for now. Zona released a quiet breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew better than to let her guard down, but the strain of constantly walking on eggshells was beginning to wear on her. Whispers in the night. That night, Zona lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Edward's snores filled the room, a rhythmic reminder of his presence even in slumber. The cabin was dark and silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the distant howl of the wind. But as the hours dragged on, Zona became aware of another sound, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It seemed to come from the direction of the window, a soft murmur that sent chills racing down her spine. She sat up slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The whisper ceased, replaced by an eerie stillness. Zona stared at the window, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a pale, ghostly figure just beyond the glass. Her heart raced as she reached for the lamp on the bedside table, fumbling to light it. The room was bathed in a warm glow, and Zona's eyes darted to the window. But there was nothing there, only the reflection of her own frightened face staring back at her. Zona sat back against the headboard, clutching the lamp like a lifeline. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of the light and her own growing paranoia. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching her. The ties that bind. The following morning, Zona woke early and began her chores as usual, determined to shake off the unease of the night before. She swept the floors, tended to the fire, and prepared breakfast, all the while trying to ignore the heavy feeling in her chest. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to her mother. Mary Jane had always been her rock, her source of strength and wisdom. Zona longed to confide in her, to share the fears that had taken root in her heart. But she knew Edward would never allow another visit so soon. Later that day, as she gathered water from the well, Zona was startled by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, expecting to see Edward, but instead found herself face to face with Anderson Jones, the young boy who often ran errands for the Shues. "Good morning, Mrs. Shue," Anderson said, tipping his hat politely. "Good morning, Anderson," Zona replied, her voice warm despite her surprise. "What brings you out here?" "Mr. Shue sent me," the boy said, shifting nervously. "He said to ask if you needed anything from town." Zona frowned, puzzled by Edward's sudden thoughtfulness. "That's kind of him," she said cautiously. "But I don't think we need anything at the moment." Anderson nodded, his expression uneasy. "If you say so, ma'am. But if you ever need help, you just let me know." Zona smiled, touched by the boy's earnestness. "Thank you, Anderson. That means a lot." As the boy turned to leave, Zona watched him go, her heart heavy with gratitude and sadness. Even in her isolation, there were still small acts of kindness to remind her that she wasn't entirely alone. The gathering storm days turned into weeks, and the winter deepened its grip on Greenbrier County. The snow fell heavier, the nights grew colder, and the sense of foreboding that had haunted Zona seemed to tighten its hold. Edward's moods became increasingly volatile, his temper flaring over the smallest things. Zona learned to tread even more carefully, avoiding confrontation whenever possible. But no matter how hard she tried, it seemed she could never truly appease him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Edward suddenly spoke, his voice sharp and accusatory. "You've been talking to your mother, haven't you?" Zona froze, her mind racing. "I haven't seen her since the last time I went to visit," she said carefully. Edward leaned forward, his eyes blazing. "Don't lie to me, Zona. I know you've been sending messages." Zona's hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. "I haven't," she insisted, her voice trembling. Edward stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You'd better not be lying," he said, his tone menacing. Zona's heart pounded as he stormed out of the room, leaving her alone with her fear. She knew she couldn't go on like this, living in constant terror of his wrath. But what choice did she have? As she sat in the flickering light of the fire, Zona's thoughts turned once again to her mother. Mary Jane had always said that the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it was buried.